She arrived at an ancestral hacienda as just another piece in a game of power. But every object, every clue, every shadow will show her that nothing is what it seems. In this place of secrets, she will find something she never had: choice. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. Sarah Mitchell couldn't remember the last time she'd had a real choice. Her entire life had been decided by others, from the town where she would live to the name she would use to attend to clients in that brothel in New Orleans. The only constant was silence. The silence of the humiliations she swallowed, of the nights she endured quietly, and of the dreams she had abandoned even before understanding them. When she received the news that she would be sold to Richard Montgomery, the powerful landowner from Blue Ridge, Georgia, she felt neither fear nor hope. Just emptiness, another transaction, another body exchanged for figures. The Georgia sky shone with an almost painful intensity as the truck advanced along the winding road toward the Daybreak estate. Sarah observed the arid landscape through the window, wondering if this land would be her final resting place. The stories about Richard Montgomery were known throughout the region, a reserved and notoriously severe man who lived isolated on his ancestral property where time seemed to stand still between the colonial walls and the tobacco fields. "We're almost there," announced Jack dryly, one of Richard's trusted men who was escorting her. "Remember the rules. The rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look directly into the boss's eyes. Don't ask questions." Sarah nodded without emotion. She had lived under similar rules all her life. The estate emerged before her eyes like a fortress from another century. Walls of pink sandstone, terracotta roofs, and an imposing carved wooden gate. The vehicle stopped in the main courtyard, where purple bougainvilleas contrasted with the stone gilded by the sun. Jack led her through silent corridors, where footsteps resonated like slow heartbeats. The few employees who crossed her path lowered their gaze as if Sarah were invisible. Finally, they arrived at a spacious room with high ceilings and wooden beams. The windows framed the view of the mountains, but they had ornate bars that, although beautiful, were still bars. In a leather armchair, with his back to her, was him. "Mr. Montgomery, here's the woman," announced Jack. The man turned slowly. He must have been about 50, with black hair sprinkled with gray and eyes as deep as dark wells. His gaze traveled over Sarah from head to toe, analytical and distant. Not like someone observing a woman, but like someone evaluating a collectible. "Leave us, Jack," he ordered in a grave and serene voice. When they were alone, the silence weighed like lead. Richard walked to the window and observed the horizon. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked without looking at her. Sarah had rehearsed 1,000 answers during the journey. All seemed useless now. "To serve you, I suppose," she responded with a barely audible voice. A fleeting smile, without joy, crossed the landowner's face. "You're wrong, but it's interesting that's your conclusion." Without adding more, he rang a small silver bell. Seconds later, an older woman with a severe face appeared. "Mrs. Carter, take the young lady to her quarters. You'll see her at dinner." Sarah followed the woman through endless corridors. She took her to the east wing of the estate, where she was assigned a surprisingly spacious and well-equipped room. But there was something disturbing. There were no mirrors, no clocks, and she couldn't fully open the windows. Time seemed suspended in that space. "The bathroom is there," Mrs. Carter pointed out. "You'll find clean clothes in the wardrobe. Mr. Montgomery expects punctuality." When the woman withdrew, Sarah explored the room. The clothes in the wardrobe weren't what she expected. There was nothing provocative or revealing, just simple but elegant dresses of good quality. On the desk, she found paper and pen, but not a single book. What did Richard Montgomery really expect from her? The hours passed in a strange calm. No servant addressed her beyond what was strictly necessary. She felt like a ghost wandering through a mansion of others' memories. When the sun began to hide behind the mountains, Mrs. Carter returned to escort her to the dining room. The dining room was an impressive chamber with a mahogany table that could seat 20. However, only 2 places were set, one at each end. Richard was already seated when she entered. "Sit down," he ordered, pointing to the chair at the other end of the table. Dinner passed in complete silence. He barely touched his food, limiting himself to observing her. Sarah ate little, uncomfortable, under that scrutinizing gaze. When the servants removed the plates, she waited for new instructions with her gaze fixed on the polished wood. "Can you read?" he asked abruptly. "Yes," she answered, surprised by the question. "And write?" "Also." Richard stood up and walked until he was beside her. His presence was overwhelming, like a shadow that covered everything. "Tomorrow we'll begin," he said enigmatically. "Now you may retire." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Uncertainty kept her alert, with her senses sharpened like a cornered animal. Begin what? What plans did that man have for her? She had heard stories about rich men who bought women to satisfy dark whims, but something in Richard's attitude didn't fit those tales. The next morning, she found a book on her bed. There was no note, no explanation, just an ancient volume of American poetry with several passages underlined. Next to the book, a small and rusted key that didn't seem to correspond to any modern lock. That was the first of many enigmatic objects that would begin to appear in her room. And with each new object, her perception of that golden cage would start to transform. What seemed like a prison began to reveal itself as a strange puzzle where she, for the first time in her life, would have to make her own decisions. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains kept silent, like impassive witnesses to a ritual that had occurred before with other women in other times. And within the walls of pink sandstone, Sarah Mitchell began to suspect that her story wasn't as unique as she believed. A week had passed since Sarah's arrival at the Daybreak estate. 7 days of strange routines and prolonged silences. Each morning she found a new object in her room. After the poetry book and the rusted key, there appeared an old map of the estate, an embroidered handkerchief with unknown initials, a sepia, photograph of a young woman whose face bore an unsettling resemblance to hers. That Sunday morning, as the sun illuminated the tiles of the central courtyard, Sarah observed from her room's window how the workers prepared to go to town. It was market day in Blue Ridge. For the first time since her arrival, the estate would be almost empty. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Montgomery requests your presence in the library," announced Mrs. Carter with her usual severe tone. The library was an impressive chamber that occupied 2 floors, with spiral staircases and shelves that reached the ceiling. Sun rays filtered through colorful stained glass, projecting luminous patterns onto the ancient volumes. Richard was seated in front of a carved desk, reviewing documents with a concentrated expression. "Sit down," he said without raising his gaze. "I suppose you've already examined the objects." It wasn't a question, but a statement. Sarah nodded as she took a seat across from him. "Do you understand what they mean?" He finally asked, looking directly into her eyes for the first time. "Not completely," she responded cautiously. "But I believe they're related to someone who was here before me." A brief smile appeared on the usually impassive face of the landowner. "Elizabeth Barnes," he pronounced, as if the name had a specific weight in the air. "The woman in the photograph. She lived on this estate 20 years ago. She resembled you, not just physically." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The way Richard pronounced that name revealed a deep history, perhaps painful. "What happened to her?" she dared to ask. "She disappeared," he responded dryly. "Or rather, she chose to disappear." He stood up and walked to one of the shelves, extracting an old leather-bound book. He opened it and took out several handwritten pages. "Her diary," he explained, extending the pages to her. "Read it and you'll understand why you're here." Elizabeth Barnes's words, written in ink faded by time, related a story astonishingly similar to hers. A woman without options, delivered to Richard as part of a dark agreement, subjected to the same enigmatic tests. But as Sarah advanced in her reading, the narrative took an unexpected turn. Elizabeth described how she had gradually discovered she could make decisions, how the mysterious objects were invitations to explore the estate, to discover its secrets. "Is this some kind of experiment?" asked Sarah when she finished reading, with a mixture of indignation and curiosity. "I would call it a process," he responded. "Elizabeth was the first. Then came others. You are the seventh." The landowner approached the window and observed the arid landscape of Georgia with a pensive expression. "The key I left you opens a trunk in the attic. The map indicates its location. If you really want to understand, you should start there." That afternoon, Sarah traveled the deserted corridors of the estate until finding the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The space was full of ancient furniture covered with sheets like silent ghosts of past eras. Following the map, she found the trunk hidden behind an old dresser. The key fit perfectly in the lock. Upon opening it, she found 6 identical notebooks, each with a different name on the cover. She leafed through the first. It belonged to Elizabeth Barnes, and continued the story she had begun to read in the library. The others contained the experiences of the women who had followed in her footsteps. All had arrived at the estate in similar circumstances. All had gone through the same process. And all eventually had departed, not as they had arrived but transformed. As she read those testimonies, night fell over the estate. Sarah barely noticed the passage of time, absorbed in the stories of those women who, like her, had been treated as objects until arriving at daybreak. According to their own words, here they had rediscovered their value, had learned to make their own decisions. Was it possible, or was it just a more sophisticated manipulation? The sound of footsteps interrupted her reading. Richard appeared, in the threshold of the attic, holding an oil lamp that projected dancing shadows over the covered furniture. "It's late," he said with a serene voice. "The workers will return soon from town." "Why me?" asked Sarah, closing Elizabeth's notebook. "Of all the women you could have chosen, why did you bring me here?" The landowner's face remained impassive, but his eyes revealed a different gleam. "Because you refused to be rescued," he answered. 3 years ago, when the government closed the brothel where you worked, you rejected the help of social services. You preferred to return to the streets before accepting others' compassion. That makes you different." Sarah remembered that day she had distrusted those well-intentioned people who promised a better life. So many broken promises had made her skeptical. "And what do you hope to achieve with me?" she insisted. "I don't hope to achieve anything," he replied. "I only offer possibilities. What you do with them depends solely on you." The following morning, Sarah found a different dress on her bed. It was intense red, elegant, without being ostentatious. Next to it, a note written with precise calligraphy. "The main door will be open today. You can leave if you wish." That disconcerted her. Was it a test, a trap? She dressed in the red dress and traveled the corridors to the main entrance. Indeed, the great carved wooden door was ajar. Beyond, the dirt road led to the main highway. Freedom. With her heart racing, Sarah crossed the threshold and began to walk along the dusty path. No one stopped her. There were no guards or servants watching. Each step she took distanced her more from the estate, but also intensified a strange sensation in her chest. Upon reaching the middle of the path, she stopped and looked back. In the high tower of the estate, she distinguished Richard's silhouette, observing her. He didn't seem worried or anxious. He merely observed like someone contemplating a fascinating experiment. Sarah remained immobile for long minutes, divided between the impulse to continue toward the highway and the growing curiosity about what was really happening in that estate. Finally, to her own surprise, she turned around and retraced her steps. When she entered the central courtyard again, Richard was already there, waiting for her. "Interesting," he commented with a measured voice. "You've already understood that it's not about bars or locks." "What is it then?" she asked, confused by her own decision to return. "A mirror," he responded enigmatically. "A mirror where you can finally see yourself as you are, not as they've made you believe you are." That night, during dinner, the usual silence was replaced by a real conversation. Richard spoke to her about the history of the estate, about his ancestors who had cultivated tobacco on those lands for generations. He didn't mention the other women or the purpose of her stay there, but something had subtly changed in his treatment of her. Sarah began to explore the estate with greater freedom. She discovered rooms closed for years, ancient documents, photographs from past eras. And among those discoveries, she began to find pieces of a much larger puzzle than the story she had been told. A puzzle where she wasn't the casual protagonist, but a carefully selected piece. In one of the drawers of the office, she found a folder with her name. Upon opening it, she discovered that Richard had followed her life for years, collecting information about her long before her arrival at Daybreak. Why this interest? What was this enigmatic man really seeking with his experiment? The answer would arrive sooner than she imagined, with the unexpected visit of a man who would alter the fragile balance that was beginning to establish itself in that strange relationship. The rainy season had arrived in Georgia. The drops rhythmically hit against the estate's windows, creating a hypnotic melody that accompanied Sarah's long hours of reading. For 3 weeks, she had devoured the diaries of the women who preceded her, finding in their words echoes of her own experience, but also disturbing revelations about Richard and his true purpose. That stormy afternoon, while reviewing ancient documents in the library, an insistent noise interrupted the usual calm. The sound of an engine approaching along the muddy road to the main entrance. Visitors. Something unusual in the hermetic routine of Daybreak. From the second-floor window, Sarah observed how a black automobile with tinted windows stopped in front of the main door. A man in a grey suit descended hurriedly, protecting himself from the rain with a briefcase over his head. Jack received him with evident disgust and, after a brief exchange of words, conducted him inside. Curiosity prevailed over prudence. Sarah descended silently via the side staircase and approached Richard's office, where male voices were rising in what seemed like a heated discussion. "The agreement was for 6 months, Montgomery," said the unknown voice, with an authoritarian tone. "The time has been fulfilled. We need the woman back." "The agreement established specific conditions, Davis," responded Richard with his characteristic calm, "and those conditions have not yet been met." "To hell with your conditions," exclaimed the visitor, hitting something, probably the desk. "My client paid a fortune for this arrangement. The woman must return now. There are other candidates waiting." Sarah felt the floor vanishing beneath her feet. Return? Where? And who was this man who spoke of her as if she were merchandise? "Miss Mitchell is not a piece of livestock that can be exchanged at convenience." Richard's voice now sounded icy. "And you know perfectly well that my methods require time. Your methods," the contempt was evident in Davis's voice, "are unnecessarily complicated. My client only requires docile women, prepared for the foundation. Not this psychological rehabilitation that you insist on applying. If your client is solely looking for modern slaves, I'm afraid he's mistaken in his provider," responded Richard. There was a tense silence, finally broken by a sarcastic laugh from the visitor. "How ironic to hear that from you, Montgomery. We all know how this project of yours began, or should I say we all know why you began it." The office door opened abruptly. Sarah barely had time to hide behind a column. The visitor, a middle-aged man, perfectly combed hair and angular face, exited with a furious expression, followed by Richard, whose usually impassive countenance now showed evident tension. "This won't end here," threatened Davis as he advanced toward the exit. "The board of directors of the New Dawn Foundation will know of your non-compliance. Tell them also that next time they should send someone with real authority, not a simple messenger," responded Richard, without altering his voice. When the automobile moved away along the muddy road, Sarah emerged from her hiding place. Richard looked at her without surprise, as if he had known of her presence the entire time. "I suppose you heard enough," he said, inviting her with a gesture to enter the office. The chamber, normally ordered, showed signs of altercation. Scattered papers, an overturned chair, a broken crystal glass on the floor. Richard sat heavily behind his desk and extracted from a drawer a bottle of aged bourbon and 2 glasses. "I think we both need this," he commented, generously serving the amber liquid. "There are questions that deserve answers, Sarah." It was the first time he had called her by her name. "Who was that man?" she asked, accepting the glass but without drinking. And what is that New Dawn Foundation? Richard contemplated his bourbon as if it contained ancestral secrets before responding. Marcus Davis, legal representative of the New Dawn Foundation, an apparently philanthropic organization that rescues vulnerable women, he made a significant pause. In reality, it's a facade for something much more sinister. He stood up and extracted a folder from a safe hidden behind a painting. He placed it on the desk in front of Sarah. "This is what the Foundation really does," he said with a grave voice. The photographs and documents showed a disturbing reality. Young women exhibited as trophies at private parties, service contracts with humiliating clauses, financial records that evidenced transactions disguised as donations. "Originally, I was part of this," he confessed with bitterness. "More than 20 years ago, when I inherited the estate, the Foundation contacted me. They offered young women to wealthy men under the appearance of social rehabilitation programs. I accepted." He drank his bourbon in a single gulp before continuing. "Elizabeth Barnes was the first to arrive here. I was different then, or perhaps I just deceived myself about who I really was." Sarah alternately looked at the documents and Richard's somber face, trying to process that confession. "What changed?" she finally asked. "Elizabeth made me see the truth," he responded, with his gaze lost in painful memories. "She refused to be a victim. She challenged me. She made me question everything. And when I finally understood the monstrosity in which I was participating, I decided to change the system from within." He stood up and walked to the window. The rain was now falling with less intensity, but the sky remained covered with dark clouds. "Since then, I've been receiving women from the Foundation, supposedly for the same purposes. But instead of converting them into modern slaves, I offer them a real opportunity to transform their lives." "The 6 women of the diaries," murmured Sarah, finally understanding. "Exactly. All arrived here like you, believing themselves to be simple merchandise. All discovered they could be much more, and all eventually became allies. Now they work in different parts of the country, identifying other women in similar situations, creating an invisible support network." Sarah felt her mind working at full speed, connecting dispersed pieces of the puzzle. That's why Davis said, "The time had been fulfilled. I'm supposed to return to the Foundation prepared for some buyer." Richard nodded gravely. "Until now, I've been able to maintain this double facade. I make them believe my method is simply more sophisticated, that it produces more valuable women. But Davis is beginning to suspect time is running out." He approached an ancient cabinet and extracted a document carefully rolled up and sealed with red wax. "It's time to move to the next phase if you're willing." He extended the document over the desk. It was a handwritten contract with detailed clauses and spaces for signatures. "This is the true purpose for which you're here, Sarah, not as a victim nor as an experiment, but as a potential ally." The contract established surprising terms. Sarah would gradually assume responsibilities in the administration of the estate, would learn about the Foundation's operations, and eventually, when she was prepared, would make decisions about the future of other rescued women. "Why me?" she asked, overwhelmed by that unexpected proposal. "Because I see in you the same strength I saw in Elizabeth," he responded with sincerity. "The same refusal to be defined by your past or by others. Expectations." Sarah observed the contract for long minutes. It was the first time in her life that someone had offered her a real choice, with all its implications. "If I sign this, what will happen with Davis and the Foundation?" "In the short term, I'll have to negotiate, gain time," explained Richard. "In the long term, with enough allies strategically located, we could dismantle the entire operation." Outside, the storm had subsided. A ray of sun filtered between the clouds, partially illuminating the office. Sarah took the pen that Richard offered her and, after a final reflective pause, signed the document. "It won't be easy," he warned, as he stamped his own signature. "What follows will require courage, astuteness, and patience." "No true transformation is easy," she responded, surprising herself with her own certainty. That night, while the estate slept, Sarah remained awake, contemplating the stars that were beginning to appear between the dispersed clouds. She had signed more than a contract. She had accepted a purpose. However, a doubt persisted in her mind. Could she really trust Richard, or was she simply falling for a more elaborate manipulation? The answer would arrive soon, with the next phase of her stay at Daybreak, where the words of the contract would be put to the test in situations she had never imagined facing. The change was as subtle as it was significant. The morning after signing the contract, Sarah found a pile of administrative documents of the estate on her desk, along with a note written in Richard's elegant calligraphy. Your first task: review, analyze, question. They weren't orders, but invitations to critical thinking. During the following weeks, the dynamic between them completely transformed. Each morning they met in the office to discuss matters of the property, the tobacco harvests, contracts with distributors, the working conditions of the employees. Richard listened to her opinions with genuine interest, challenging her to defend her viewpoints and celebrating when she found innovative solutions. It's not enough to be right, he explained during a heated discussion about salaries. You must learn to persuade, to negotiate, to detect resistance before it manifests openly. That October afternoon, while they reviewed correspondence in the library, Jack interrupted with unexpected news. Mr. Montgomery, visitors have arrived. 3 women. They say they come on behalf of Miss Laura. Sarah noticed how the landowner's face illuminated with an expression she had never seen in him, something similar to hope. Show them to the main salon, he ordered, rising precipitately, and prepare rooms in the east wing. He turned to Sarah with a significant look. The time has come to expand your education, he said enigmatically. Follow me. In the salon awaited 3 women of diverse ages and aspects, a young Native American woman of barely 20 with a wary look, a mature woman of elegant bearing and confident mannerisms, and a third middle-aged, whose face showed scars barely concealed by careful makeup. Welcome to Daybreak, greeted Richard with unusual warmth. This is Sarah Mitchell, my new collaborator. The woman of elegant bearing stepped forward and studied Sarah with an evaluating gaze before extending her hand. I'm Laura Vega, she presented herself with a clear and firm voice. The third of the diaries you read. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Laura Vega, the woman whose writings had been the most detailed, the most raw in their description of the transformation process. A pleasure to meet you in person, responded Sarah, shaking her hand firmly. The other 2 women introduced themselves as Star and Marianne. Both had been rescued recently from compromising situations. Star from a loan shark who collected debts with personal favors, Marianne from an abusive marriage where she functioned as little more than a servant. When the servants withdrew, leaving them alone, the atmosphere changed. Laura extracted from her purse several envelopes and USB drives that she delivered to Richard. The network expands, she informed with professional satisfaction. We have new contacts in Los Angeles, Miami and New York City, and I've found something else. She deployed over the table a map where she had marked properties in different points of the country. We believe these are the Foundation's training centers, places like Daybreak, but with very different purposes. Richard examined the map with a somber expression. Reliable sources. Direct testimonies from women who managed to escape, confirmed Laura. Some almost didn't make it. During dinner, Sarah observed the interaction between Richard and Laura. It was evident that they shared a deep history, an understanding that went beyond words. The furtive glances, the involuntary gestures, the unfinished phrases that the other completed mentally. Everything suggested an almost telepathic bond. Later, while showing Star and Marianne to their rooms, Sarah couldn't contain her curiosity. What happened between Richard and Laura? She asked directly to Marianne, who seemed the most communicative. The woman smiled with complicity. The foundational myth of our small revolution, she responded in a low voice. Laura didn't just transform here, she transformed Richard. She was the first who really confronted him, who made him look directly at his own contradictions. Elizabeth opened the door, but Laura walked through it completely. The next morning, Sarah discovered that her role had changed again. She was no longer just an apprentice administrator, but a kind of mentor for Star and Marianne. Richard had assigned her the task of guiding them in the first stages of their adaptation. "How can I teach them what I'm barely learning?" she questioned Richard when she received the instruction. "Sometimes we teach best what we most need to learn," he responded with one of his enigmatic phrases. "Observe them, listen to them. Each woman arrives here with her own story, her own fears, her own strengths. Your task is to help them discover the latter." During the following weeks, Sarah immersed herself in this new responsibility. She discovered that Star had a natural talent for numbers and accounting, skills she had never been able to develop for lack of opportunities. Marianne, for her part, possessed an astonishing capacity for mediation and conflict resolution, forged in years of appeasing a volatile husband. Meanwhile, Laura and Richard spent long hours enclosed in the office, planning strategies against the New Dawn Foundation. On occasions, Sarah was invited to these meetings, where she discovered the true magnitude of the operation. It wasn't just about rescuing women individually, but about building a support network that extended throughout the entire United States. Safe houses, new identities, legitimate work opportunities, legal advice. A parallel system of protection and empowerment that operated in the shadows of society. One afternoon, while reviewing financial documents, Sarah found something disturbing. A series of suspicious transfers from Richard's personal accounts to foreign entities. Enormous quantities of money that disappeared monthly without apparent justification in the records of the estate. When she confronted him about it, Richard showed neither surprise nor annoyance, but a strange satisfaction. "I was waiting for you to discover it," he commented with approval. "It's the final test, in a way." He opened his computer and showed Sarah the truth behind those transfers. Each dollar left his personal accounts toward legitimate foundations that, in turn, discreetly financed the network of rescued women. "The estate produces enough to maintain our operation here," he explained, "but the network grows. It needs more resources." "You're emptying your personal fortune," observed Sarah, astonished by the magnitude of the sacrifice. "It's the minimum I can do," he responded with a tone that admitted no reply. "For years I benefited from a system that treated women as merchandise. Now, every dollar I have must serve to dismantle it." That night, unable to fall asleep, Sarah went out to walk through the gardens under the silver light of the full moon. She found Laura seated next to the central fountain, smoking a cigarette with a pensive expression. "Insomnia?" asked the woman, offering Sarah a cigarette that she rejected with a gesture. "Too much information to process," confessed Sarah, sitting beside her. "Each day I discover something new that completely changes my perception of what's happening here." Laura smiled with understanding. "I call it the vertigo of truth," she commented, exhaling a column of smoke toward the starry sky. "It's terrifying and liberating at the same time." They remained in silence for a few minutes, listening to the soft murmur of water in the fountain. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sarah finally dared. "Go ahead." "You and Richard, was there something between you?" Laura extinguished the cigarette and contemplated the ashes with attention before responding. "There was respect, then admiration. After something deeper," she made a significant pause. "But never romantic, if that's what you're asking. Our connection is different, more like accomplices than lovers." She stood up and looked toward the illuminated window of the office, where Richard's silhouette was outlined against the light. "He's sick, you know," she revealed with a barely audible voice. "A degenerative heart condition. The doctors have given him less than a year." The news hit Sarah like an invisible fist. Suddenly, many things made sense. The barely dissimulated urgency in his teachings, the meticulous documentation of all processes, the insistence that she assume more and more responsibilities. "That's why you're here," continued Laura. "That's why we're all here now. Time is running out and we need to establish the transition." "Transition? Someone must continue his work when he's gone," explained Laura, looking at her significantly. "And he has chosen his successor." The pool revelation remained suspended in the night air like an inevitable sentence. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility, settle upon her shoulders, immense and overwhelming. "Why me?" she murmured, more to herself than to Laura. "I've barely been here a few months. There are others with more experience, like you." "I can't be the visible face of this," responded Laura with a sad smile. "My face is in too many police files. We need someone without a documented past, someone who can move freely between both worlds." The next day, Richard convened a meeting with all the women present at the estate. In the main salon, under the great portrait of his grandfather, the landowner confirmed what Laura had revealed. His health was deteriorating, and it was time to prepare the future of the network. "I've made a decision that will affect all of you," he announced with a firm but tired voice. "Sarah Mitchell will gradually assume control of our operations." The gazes were directed towards Sarah, who remained immobile, still processing the impact of that public decision. "But there's something else," continued Richard. "The New Dawn Foundation has intensified its search. Davis has filed lawsuits, has hired private investigators. It's a matter of time before they connect the dots." He extracted an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Sarah. "That's why we need to implement the final phase of our plan," he concluded with gravity. "A new identity, a new beginning, or more precisely, a strategic disappearance." Inside the envelope, Sarah found a passport, credit cards, and identity documents, all in the name of a certain Emma Wilson, a stranger whose face was hers. The choice was before her: disappear to be able to continue the mission, or maintain her recently recovered identity at the risk of losing everything. Sarah's decision wasn't immediate. For 3 days she locked herself in her room, reading over and over the diaries of the women who had preceded her, especially that of Elizabeth Barnes. She sought in those handwritten pages some answer, some guide for the dilemma she faced. Disappear. Become another person. Abandon an identity she was just beginning to reconstruct. Wasn't that exactly what they had done with her throughout her entire life? Erase her, redefine her, mold her according to the needs of others. But then, on the last page of Elizabeth's diary, she found something she had overlooked in previous readings. A phrase, underlined in red ink. "Sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is choosing to disappear on our own terms." On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah left her room and headed directly to Richard's office. She found him reviewing documents, paler, and more emaciated than usual, but with the same intensity in his gaze. "I've made my decision," she announced without preambles. "I'll accept the new identity, but with conditions." Richard left the papers and indicated for her to sit. "I'm listening. First, I want to meet all the women of the network, personally, not just reports and photographs. I need to understand who I'll be protecting," began Sarah with a firm voice. "Second, I demand total transparency about the funds and operations. If I'm going to risk my life for this cause, I don't want unpleasant surprises later." The landowner nodded with a hint of a smile on his lips. "Anything else?" "Yes, the most important." Sarah looked directly into his eyes. "I want the truth about Elizabeth Barnes. The complete truth." A tense silence settled between them. Richard rose slowly and walked to the window, where he remained observing the landscape for long minutes. "Elizabeth didn't just disappear," he said finally without turning. "She became someone else. Someone who has been supervising the entire operation from the shadows for years." He turned to look at Sarah with an expression he had never shown before, pure vulnerability. "Elizabeth Barnes became Margaret Thompson, the supposed distant cousin who administers my properties abroad. The woman who signs the documents, who manages the international bank accounts, who coordinates the legal efforts against traffickers and exploiters. Is she alive?" asked Sarah, processing that unexpected revelation. "And more powerful than ever," confirmed Richard, "but completely invisible to those who might recognize her. She's our ace in the hole." He opened a secret drawer in his desk and extracted a recent photograph. An elegant woman with silver hair and penetrating gaze, unrecognizable with respect to the young woman of the sepia photograph, but with the same intensity in her eyes. "She was my redemption and will be your mentor in this new phase," explained Richard. She's waiting for you in Charleston. Events succeeded each other vertiginously from that moment. In less than a week, the plan was in motion. The first phase consisted of an elaborate staging. Sarah Mitchell would officially flee from the estate, leaving indications that she planned to return to New Orleans. "Davis must believe I failed with you," explained Richard as they reviewed the details, "that you simply rebelled and escaped." Meanwhile, Emma Wilson, an archaeologist specialized in Native American culture, would discreetly appear in Charleston to join a research project financed by an international foundation, controlled, of course, by Margaret Thompson. The night. Before her departure, an intimate dinner was celebrated at the estate. Laura, Star, Marianne, and 2 more women who had recently arrived gathered in the main dining room, decorated with wildflowers and candles. Richard, against medical advice, had insisted on opening a bottle of aged bourbon from his personal reserve. "To the invisible women," he toasted, raising his glass. "May their voices, though whispered, change the world." After dinner, while the others withdrew, Sarah remained in the salon with Richard. There were so many questions still unanswered, so many concerns about the future. "I'm afraid," she finally confessed, allowing herself to be vulnerable for the first time. Not of Davis or the foundation, but of not being up to the task, of failing all these women. Richard observed her with a mixture of understanding and confidence. "Fear is natural, Sarah. I felt it too when I began to defy the system. But fear is not your enemy, it's your advisor." He made a significant pause. "Besides, you won't be alone, Elizabeth. Margaret will be with you, and Laura, and all the others." He approached an ancient trunk and extracted an object wrapped in silk cloth. Upon unwrapping it, Sarah recognized the stylographic pen with which she had signed the contract weeks ago. "It belonged to my grandfather," explained Richard, "an imperfect man like me, but who in his last years tried to redeem himself for his errors. Now it's yours." Sarah accepted the gift, moved by the symbolic gesture. "How did you know it would work with me?" she asked. "Your method, this process." "I didn't know," he admitted with a tired smile. "Each woman who arrives here represents a risk, a gamble. Some simply leave when they discover the door is open. Others remain but never manage to free themselves from their internal chains." He made a reflective pause. "But you showed something special from the beginning, a spark of rebellion still alive under layers of resignation. At dawn, everything was ready. An automobile with tinted windows waited at the back entrance of the estate. Emma Wilson's suitcases, carefully prepared with clothes, documents, and a new life, were already in the trunk. Only the farewell was missing. Richard waited for her in the central courtyard, next to the fountain where she had conversed with Laura nights ago. In the light of dawn, he seemed more fragile, more human. He was no longer the enigmatic and fearsome landowner of the rumors, but a man fighting against his own demons and against the time that was escaping him. "There's something you should know before departing," he said when she approached. "Something I haven't shared with anyone else." He handed her an envelope sealed with red wax. "Open it when you're with Margaret," he instructed with seriousness. "It contains the location of all my undeclared assets, properties registered under false names, accounts abroad. Everything necessary to keep the network functioning for decades, even if the Foundation discovers this estate." Sarah kept the envelope in her purse, understanding the magnitude of that trust. "One last thing," added Richard. "The name Emma Wilson wasn't chosen randomly. Emma was my mother's name. Wilson, Elizabeth's mother's maiden name. A final link, an invisible thread that would connect her forever with the history she now inherited." The farewell embrace was brief but intense. No more words were needed. Richard observed her get into the automobile and remained immobile while the vehicle moved away along the dirt road, taking Sarah Mitchell away forever and bringing Emma Wilson into the world. The journey to Charleston was long and solitary. Sarah, now Emma, spent hours looking through the window, observing how the landscape gradually transformed, from the arid mountains of Georgia to the plains of South Carolina, from the Central Plateau to the coastal areas of the Atlantic. Dusk, the automobile stopped in front of an elegant colonial house in Charleston's historic center. The walls of an intense blue contrasted with the white moldings. Pink bougainvilleas fell like waterfalls over the exterior wall. The main door opened before Emma could ring the bell. In the threshold, the woman from the photograph, Margaret Thompson, formerly Elizabeth Barnes, the first of all. Her eyes, of an intense green, studied Emma with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. "Welcome to your new life," she greeted, inviting her to enter. The interior of the house was fresh and luminous, with high ceilings and hydraulic mosaic floors. On the walls, framed photographs showed women of different ages and origins. Emma recognized some from the files she had studied at the estate. "The extended family," explained Margaret, following her gaze. "All have gone through the same as... Are you? All have been reborn with different names, different lives." She led them to a study in the back of the house. Unlike Richard's somber office, this room was inundated with natural light and vibrant colors. On a wide desk rested a voluminous manuscript. "My latest work," commented Margaret with barely disguised pride. "I just sent it to the printer." Emma took the manuscript and read the title. "Women of Silence, Testimonies of Survival and Rebirth." The author's name anonymous. "It's the story of all of us," explained Margaret, "without real names, without precise locations, but with the emotional truth intact. The first step toward collective visibility." That night, after settling into her new room, Emma finally opened the envelope that Richard had given her. Besides the promised financial documents, she found a personal letter. "Dear Emma, by the time you read this, you will have begun your new life. The path you've chosen won't be easy, but it will be yours, completely yours. There's one last truth you should know, a truth that not even Margaret knows in its entirety. The New Dawn Foundation isn't just a network of traffickers. It's part of a wider, more complex system that involves politicians, businessmen, and public figures. People with respectable names who appear in newspapers and magazines as benefactors of society. For years, I've been collecting evidence against them. Names, dates, transfers, photographs. Everything is in a safe at the International Bank of Charleston. The key is inside the stylographic pen I gave you. Turn the golden end and it will open. What to do with this information will be your decision. Publishing it could be dangerous. Keeping it could be a burden. Using it strategically could be our greatest advantage. I trust in your judgment, as I trusted in your capacity to transform yourself. With admiration and hope, Richard Montgomery. 6. Months later, the book Women of Silence became an unexpected editorial phenomenon. Translated into 12 languages, it generated debates, inspired social movements, and, most importantly, connected women throughout the country who recognized their own stories in those pages. Emma Wilson, the archaeologist, occasionally appeared in interviews as an expert on the topic, speaking with knowledge and passion about female empowerment and the invisible structures of exploitation. No one suspected that articulate academic had once been Sarah Mitchell, the woman sold to a landowner in Georgia. In parallel, mysterious leaks began to appear in digital media, documents that linked prominent public figures with the New Dawn Foundation. Not enough to provoke massive arrests, but sufficient to generate unease to sow the seed of doubt. Emma's strategy was clear, not a frontal explosion, but a war of attrition. And meanwhile, the network continued growing. Safe houses, new identities, work opportunities, psychological support. An invisible empire built by women whom society had tried to silence. Richard Montgomery didn't live to see these developments. His condition unexpectedly worsened, and he departed in silence one spring afternoon. According to his will, the Daybreak estate passed into the hands of a foundation dedicated to the rehabilitation of women in vulnerable situations. The executive direction fell to Laura Vega. A year after the publication of the book, Emma received an unexpected invitation. The National University would hold a symposium on human trafficking and had selected her as the main speaker. The event would take place in New York City, in the largest auditorium on campus. While preparing her presentation in her Charleston study, she received a call from Margaret. "Marcus Davis will be among the attendees," she informed without preambles. He now directs the Department of Social Affairs of an influential business group. He remains key in the foundation, although they've changed names after the scandal. Emma felt her heart accelerate. It would be the first time she would directly confront one of the men of the system she had sworn to dismantle. "Do you think he'll recognize me?" she asked, although she knew the answer. "Sarah Mitchell disappeared more than a year ago," responded Margaret with certainty. "And Emma Wilson has built an impeccable public presence. But yes, we should be cautious." On the day of the conference, the auditorium was packed. Academics, students, journalists, and representatives of social organizations had come to hear her. In the third row, just as Margaret had anticipated, was Marcus Davis, observing her with an impenetrable expression. Emma ascended to the podium with a firm step. She had prepared for this moment for months, not only to give a brilliant conference, but to face her past without fear paralyzing her. "I'll begin with a story," she said into the microphone with a clear and serene voice. "The story of a woman without a name who was treated as merchandise. A woman who recovered her voice and discovered that sometimes the greatest power resides in the capacity to disappear, to be reborn on our own terms." Her eyes briefly met Davis's. There was no recognition in his gaze, only the discomfort of someone who hears truths they would prefer to ignore. Emma continued her presentation, displaying statistics, anonymous testimonies, sociological analyses. Her voice filled the auditorium with authority and conviction. She was no longer that silenced woman who had arrived at the Daybreak estate. She was a force of nature, a voice that spoke for thousands of invisible women. Upon finishing, amid enthusiastic applause, a young student raised her hand for the last question. "Dr. Wilson, do you believe it's possible to completely dismantle these exploitation networks?" Emma smiled, thinking of all the women who worked silently from the shadows. Margaret, Laura, Star, Marianne, and so many others. She thought of Richard and his imperfect redemption. She thought of Sarah Mitchell, the woman she had been, and, in a certain way, continued to be in the deepest part of her being. "Not only is it possible," she responded with absolute conviction, "it's inevitable. Because when women who were silenced find their voice, there's no power in this world capable of making them quiet again." In the last row of the auditorium, a woman with silver hair smiled with approval. Margaret Thompson, formerly Elizabeth Barnes, the first of all, nodded imperceptibly. The circle had been completed, and somewhere, perhaps on that estate of pink sandstone walls, the spirit of Richard Montgomery finally found the peace he had sought for decades. His legacy not only continued, but multiplied, extending its roots throughout the entire country, transforming lives in a way that not even he had been able to imagine. Because sometimes, the greatest power resides in the capacity to disappear so that others can find their voice. Dear listeners, we hope that Sarah Mitchell's story has deeply moved you. The transformation journey we've just shared reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, there exists the possibility of reinventing oneself and finding purpose. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about women who transformed their reality. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of American life, its traditions, its challenges, and its silent triumphs. What other stories would you like to hear? Do you know real women who have transformed their circumstances in extraordinary ways?